November 27th, 1095. In the French town of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before an assembly that would witness one of history's most consequential speeches. But to understand why his words ignited a fire that would burn across 3 continents for 2 centuries, we must first understand the world that was ready to explode. Europe in the late 11th century was a society under tremendous pressure. Population was growing rapidly, but arable land remained fixed. The warrior nobility, the backbone of feudal society, found their traditional role increasingly constrained by the Peace of God movement, which sought to limit private warfare and protect non-combatants. These knights, trained from childhood for war, suddenly faced a world telling them when, where, and against whom they could fight. Meanwhile, the Church was undergoing its own revolution. The Gregorian reform had begun asserting papal authority over secular rulers, challenging centuries of established practice. Gregory VII had humiliated Emperor Henry IV at Canossa in 1077, demonstrating that spiritual authority could triumph over temporal power. His successor, Urban II, inherited both this enhanced papal prestige and the burden of proving that the Church could lead Christendom in more than just spiritual matters. But it was events in the East that provided Urban with his opportunity. And here we must examine the full complexity of Christian-Muslim relations in the 11th century. The Byzantine Empire, for 7 centuries the bulwark of Eastern Christianity, was facing existential crisis not merely from military defeat, but from systematic pressure on Christian communities throughout the Islamic world. The catastrophic defeat at Manzikert in 1071 had not merely cost them a battle. It had effectively ended Byzantine control over Anatolia, the heartland that had sustained the empire for generations. But Manzikert was part of a broader pattern of Islamic expansion that had been accelerating since the mid-11th century, often accompanied by policies that deliberately marginalized Christian populations. The Seljuk conquests were not simply territorial changes, but represented a fundamental shift in how Islamic rulers governed Christian subjects. Unlike the earlier Umayyad and Abbasid periods, which had generally maintained the dhimmi system, allowing Christian and Jewish communities to practice their faiths under certain restrictions, the Seljuk period saw increasing pressure for conversion and systematic discrimination against non-Muslims. Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which had continued largely unimpeded under previous Islamic dynasties, became increasingly difficult and dangerous under Seljuk rule. Pilgrims reported harassment, extortion, and violence that had been rare in earlier centuries. The destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009 by the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, while later rebuilt, remained a vivid symbol of Islamic hostility to Christian sacred sites. More systematically, the expansion of Turkish power in Anatolia displaced entire Christian communities who had lived there for centuries. The policy of Devshirme, the forced recruitment of Christian children for conversion to Islam and service in the military, though more fully developed later under the Ottomans, had its origins in this period. Entire regions that had been predominantly Christian for centuries were being transformed through a combination of military conquest, forced conversion, and demographic replacement. The appeals from Eastern Christians were not merely about political sovereignty, but about cultural and religious survival. Reports reaching the West described churches being converted to mosques, Christian clergy being humiliated or killed, and systematic attempts to erase Christian presence from lands that had been Christian since apostolic times. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was a skilled diplomat and competent general, but he understood that Byzantium alone could not reverse this disaster. His appeals to the West were carefully crafted, emphasizing not just shared Christian identity, but genuine persecution of fellow Christians under Islamic rule. While he downplayed the theological differences that had been growing between Eastern and Western Christianity since the formal schism of 1054, he emphasized the common threat that Islamic expansion posed to all Christian communities. When Alexios's ambassadors reached Urban at the Council of Piacenza in March 1095, they brought not just requests for military assistance, but detailed accounts of Christians suffering under Muslim rule. These reports, whether accurate in every detail or not, provided Urban with concrete justifications for military action that went beyond abstract theological differences or political ambitions. Urban saw an opportunity to reunite Eastern and Western Christianity under papal leadership, to provide a sanctified outlet for Western violence, and to enhance the Church's temporal authority through a great spiritual enterprise. But he also recognized that the Islamic threat to Christianity was real and systemic, requiring a coordinated response that individual Christian communities could not mount alone. Urban's speech at Clermont was a masterpiece of medieval rhetoric, carefully calibrated to appeal to different audiences. To the nobles, he offered adventure, glory, and the prospect of carving out new territories in the East. To the poor, he promised spiritual rewards and perhaps material betterment. To all, he painted a picture of Eastern Christians suffering under Muslim rule, their holy places defiled, their ancient rites trampled. Let those who have been accustomed unjustly to wage private warfare against the faithful now go against the infidels, Urban declared, and end with victory this war which should have been begun long ago. But his most powerful promise was spiritual. All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Nobles tore cloth from their garments to fashion crosses, crying, "Deus vult," God wills it. But Urban had unleashed forces beyond his control, or even his imagination. What he envisioned as a disciplined military expedition led by the Church quickly became something far more complex and chaotic. The first to respond were not the great nobles Urban had hoped to inspire, but ordinary people swept up in apocalyptic fervor. Preachers like Peter the Hermit and Count Emicho of Flaunheim gathered massive followings, promising that faith alone would open the path to Jerusalem. These popular movements revealed both the genuine spiritual hunger of medieval society and its darker undercurrents. The massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhineland during 1096 were not accidental byproducts of crusading enthusiasm. They reflected a logic that, if the enemies of Christ in the East deserve destruction, why not begin with those closer to home? The attacks on Jewish communities in Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne represented the first large-scale pogroms in European history, establishing a horrific precedent that would haunt Jewish-Christian relations for centuries. When these popular armies reached Byzantine territory, They brought chaos rather than assistance. Alexios quickly ferried them across the Bosphorus, where most were slaughtered by experienced Turkish forces. The disaster served as a sobering preview of the challenges awaiting any Western army in unfamiliar territory against skilled opponents. The main crusading armies that departed in 1096 represented a different phenomenon entirely. These were led by some of Europe's most powerful nobles: Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine; Bohemond of Taranto, the ambitious Norman prince; Raymond of St. Gilles, Count of Toulouse; and others who commanded substantial resources and military experience. Yet even these organized forces faced challenges that would have defeated lesser expeditions. The logistics of moving tens of thousands of people across Europe and into Asia Minor were staggering. Food, water, fodder for horses, medical care, navigation through unfamiliar territory. Every aspect of the journey tested medieval organizational capabilities to their limits. More fundamentally, the crusading armies had to navigate the complex politics of Byzantium and the Islamic world with virtually no understanding of either. Alexios's requirement that the crusading leaders swear oaths of allegiance created immediate tensions, as Western nobles chafed at acknowledging the authority of an Eastern emperor they viewed as effeminate and possibly heretical. The Siege of Antioch from October 1097 to June 1098 became the defining experience of the First Crusade. The city was virtually impregnable, its walls stretching for miles across mountainous terrain, its garrison well-supplied and confident. For 8 months, the Crusaders found themselves besieged by winter, disease, starvation, and despair as much as they were besieging the city. The discovery of what was proclaimed to be the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side on the cross, by a peasant named Peter Bartholomew illustrates the complex interplay of faith, psychology, and politics that characterized the Crusades. Whether genuine relic or pious fraud, the lance provided exactly the spiritual catalyst the demoralized army needed. The successful capture of Antioch through the treachery of a guard named Pyrrhus, followed immediately by the arrival of a relief army under Kerboga, Atabeg of Mosul, compressed triumph and potential disaster into a few desperate days. The Crusaders' subsequent victory over Kerboga's much larger force seemed to validate every claim about divine favor and Christian superiority. The march from Antioch to Jerusalem revealed how thoroughly the crusading ideal had been transformed by experience. The army that approached the Holy City in June 1099 was vastly different from the enthusiastic multitudes that had departed Europe 3 years earlier. Hardened by warfare, shaped by victory and loss, deeply altered by encounters with Eastern Christianity and Islam, they represented something new in European history. The siege of Jerusalem lasted barely 5 weeks, but its conclusion on July 15, 1099, became the most controversial moment of the entire crusading movement. The massacre that followed the city's fall was extreme even by medieval standards. Contemporary accounts, both Christian and Muslim, describe streets flowing with blood, bodies piled in houses and courtyards, the systematic slaughter of virtually the entire population. This violence was not merely the result of military necessity or the heat of battle. It reflected a deliberate choice to purify the holy city through bloodshed, to make Jerusalem Christian not just through conquest, but through the complete elimination of its non-Christian inhabitants. The theological justification that Muslim and Jewish presence had polluted sacred ground revealed how religious conviction could sanctify the most extreme brutality. The successful conclusion of the First Crusade created a psychological revolution in Western Christianity. For the first time in centuries, Christian armies had not merely defended their territory, but had expanded it, conquering lands that had been Muslim for over 4 centuries. The impossible had become reality through what could only be interpreted as divine intervention. Yet victory also created new problems. The establishment of the Crusader States required Western Europeans to become permanent residents of the Levant, to govern populations they barely understood, and to maintain military dominance in a region where they would always be outnumbered and culturally isolated. The success of the First Crusade was also the beginning of its own undoing. The transformation of Jerusalem into a Western Christian city represented more than territorial conquest. It symbolized the assertion of Western Christian superiority over both Eastern Christianity and Islam. The Latin Patriarch installed in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre displaced not just Muslim authority, but also the Eastern Christian communities that had maintained their presence in the city throughout centuries of Islamic rule. The First Crusade succeeded because it occurred at a unique historical moment when Western European expansion coincided with Islamic political fragmentation. The Seljuk Empire was fragmenting into competing Atabegs. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt was in decline, and local rulers were more concerned with immediate threats than with the long-term implications of Christian conquest. But success created expectations that could not be sustained. The crusading ideal, validated by victory, became a permanent feature of Western Christian identity. Future generations would launch crusade after crusade, expecting divine intervention to repeat the miracle of 1099, rarely understanding that the specific conditions that enabled the First Crusade's success were historical anomalies rather than divine guarantees. As we prepare to examine the longer history of the Crusades, we must remember that the events of 1095 to 1099 established patterns of thought and behavior that would influence European expansion, religious identity, and East-West relations for centuries to come. The First Crusade was not merely a medieval military campaign. It was the foundational event that created the template for Western Christian interaction with the non-Christian world, for better and for worse. The year 1100 dawned on a transformed world. Jerusalem flew Christian banners for the first time in over 4 centuries, and 4 Crusader states stretched along the eastern Mediterranean coast like a chain of European fortresses thrust into the heart of the Islamic world. But success brought challenges that victory could not solve. How do you govern populations that vastly outnumber you? How do you maintain European identity while adapting to Middle Eastern realities? How do you sustain religious fervor when survival demands pragmatic compromise? The Crusader states, Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli, represented one of history's most audacious experiments in colonial governance. These were not mere military occupations, but attempts to transplant European feudal society into an alien environment, creating hybrid cultures that were neither fully Western nor Eastern, neither purely Christian nor entirely separate from their Islamic context. Godfrey of Bouillon's decision to style himself Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, rather than King of Jerusalem, revealed the delicate balance these new rulers had to maintain. They were simultaneously European nobles, Christian warriors, and Middle Eastern potentates, each role demanding different skills and creating different obligations. The demographic reality was stark. Europeans comprised perhaps 5% of the population in most Crusader territories. The majority remained Muslim, with substantial Eastern Christian minorities who often viewed the Latin newcomers with deep suspicion. Survival required accommodation, collaboration, and the development of administrative systems that could function across religious and cultural boundaries. This practical necessity created what we might call Crusader pragmatism, a willingness to work with Muslim merchants, employ Eastern Christian administrators, and even ally with Muslim rulers against other Christians when circumstances demanded. Such flexibility horrified purists in Europe, who expected the Crusader states to maintain the religious purity that had supposedly justified their creation. The development of the military orders, the Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and later the Teutonic Knights, represented an innovative response to these challenges. These warrior monks combined religious devotion with military professionalism and financial acumen, becoming the backbone of Crusader defense and the pioneers of medieval banking. Their international networks and papal privileges made them virtually independent powers within the Christian world. The initial Islamic response to the Crusader conquests was fragmented and ineffective, reflecting the political divisions that had enabled Christian success in the first place. Local rulers were more concerned with immediate survival and regional power struggles than with coordinating resistance to the Christian invaders. But the trauma of Jerusalem's fall and the massacres that followed gradually catalyzed a broader Islamic revival. The concept of jihad, which had become largely theoretical during centuries of Islamic expansion and consolidation, was revitalized as both religious duty and political strategy. Scholars and preachers began articulating a vision of Islamic unity that transcended the ethnic and sectarian divisions that had characterized the Muslim world. The rise of Imad ad-Din Zengi in northern Syria during the 1120s marked the beginning of systematic Islamic counter-crusade. Zengi understood that defeating the Crusaders required more than military skill. It demanded the creation of unified Islamic states capable of sustained warfare against well-fortified enemies. His conquest of Edessa in 1144, the first Crusader capital to fall, sent shockwaves through Christian Europe and triggered the Second Crusade. The fall of Edessa in 1144 shattered the myth of Crusader invincibility and forced European leaders to confront the reality that their Eastern conquests were not divinely guaranteed. The Second Crusade, preached by Bernard of Clairvaux and led by Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, represented European Christianity's attempt to recapture the spiritual energy of the First Crusade. But the Second Crusade revealed how thoroughly circumstances had changed since 1099. The Byzantine Empire, no longer desperate for Western assistance, viewed the new crusading armies with suspicion and provided minimal support. The Islamic world, increasingly unified under leaders like Zengi and his son Nur ad-Din, was prepared for Christian attack in ways their predecessors had not been. The disastrous failure of the Second Crusade at Damascus in 1148 marked a turning point in crusading history. For the first time, a major crusading expedition had achieved absolutely nothing, despite being led by two of Europe's most powerful monarchs and blessed by the Church's most influential preacher. The psychological impact was devastating, forcing both participants and observers to question whether God still favored the Christian cause. More significantly, the Second Crusade's failure demonstrated that the conditions enabling the First Crusade's success had been historically specific rather than divinely ordained. Islamic political unity, Byzantine ambivalence, and European overconfidence had created a strategic environment fundamentally different from that of 1095 to 1099. Saladin's path to power required him to navigate the complex relationship between Sunni Damascus and Shia Cairo, ultimately overthrowing the Fatimid Caliphate and uniting Egypt and Syria under his rule. This achievement was as much about Islamic politics as Christian warfare. Saladin had to prove his religious credentials to legitimize his authority, while demonstrating military competence to maintain it. The Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187, represented the culmination of Saladin's strategic vision. By manipulating the Crusader leadership into abandoning their defensive positions and fighting in the desert during summer, he achieved a victory so complete that it effectively ended the first phase of Crusader dominance. The capture of the True Cross and the decimation of the military orders removed both the symbolic and practical foundations of Crusader power. But Saladin's treatment of Jerusalem after its surrender in October 1187 revealed the complexity of his character and objectives. Unlike the Christian conquest of 1099, the Islamic reconquest was marked by relative restraint and negotiated terms. Saladin's magnanimity toward Christian prisoners and his protection of pilgrims created a reputation for chivalric honor that impressed even his enemies. The Third Crusade brought together three of medieval Europe's most legendary rulers in response to Saladin's conquests. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard I of England represented the pinnacle of European royal power and military capability. Yet their expedition also illustrated the practical constraints that limited even the most ambitious medieval enterprises. Frederick's death by drowning in the Salef River eliminated the most experienced military commander and removed the largest contingent before the campaign truly began. Philip's early departure due to political pressures in France demonstrated how domestic concerns could override even the most sacred obligations. Richard's brilliant tactical victories, coupled with his ultimate failure to recapture Jerusalem, revealed the limits of individual heroism in the face of strategic realities. The relationship between Richard and Saladin, conducted largely through diplomatic intermediaries, became the stuff of legend precisely because it embodied medieval ideals of chivalric honor transcending religious differences. Their mutual respect, expressed through gifts, negotiations, and shared appreciation for martial prowess, created a template for noble enemy relationships that would influence European literature and political thought for centuries. Yet the Third Crusade's ultimate failure to recapture Jerusalem marked a fundamental shift in crusading ideology. Future expeditions would increasingly focus on strategic objectives rather than symbolic ones, acknowledging that the Holy City's reconquest required military capabilities beyond what even the most powerful Christian monarchs could deploy. The Fourth Crusade's notorious diversion to Constantinople in 1204 represents both the corruption of crusading ideals and their remarkable adaptability. What began as Pope Innocent III's attempt to reclaim Jerusalem through Egypt became history's most scandalous betrayal of crusading principles, and perhaps its most revealing moment. The expedition's origins seemed promising. Innocent III, arguably the most powerful pope in history, had learned from previous failures and planned a methodical campaign targeting Egypt, the strategic heart of Ayyubid power. The Crusaders contracted with Venice for transportation, agreeing to pay 85,000 marks for ships and supplies, a sum that reflected both the expedition's ambition and the growing commercialization of crusading. But when the Crusaders assembled in Venice in 1202, they faced a crisis that would define their entire enterprise. Fewer knights had joined than expected, leaving them unable to pay the Venetians the agreed sum. Doge Enrico Dandolo, the blind octogenarian who ruled Venice, proposed a solution that revealed his political genius. The Crusaders would help Venice recapture the Dalmatian city of Zara, which had recently allied with Hungary. The attack on Zara represented the first fundamental compromise. Here was a Catholic city, under the protection of a king who had himself taken crusading vows, being attacked by an army supposedly fighting for Christ. Pope Innocent III's excommunication of the entire expedition was ignored. The Crusaders had already discovered that survival trumped spiritual purity. The arrival of Alexios IV Angelos in the Crusader camp transformed a financial crisis into a dynastic opportunity. This young Byzantine prince, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, promised enormous payments and military support if the Crusaders would restore his father to the throne. The offer was irresistible to an expedition already deep in debt and far from its original objective. The first siege of Constantinople in July 1203 succeeded beyond expectations. The city's sea wall, considered impregnable, was breached by Venetian naval expertise, and Emperor Alexios III fled rather than fight. Isaac II was restored, and his son crowned as Alexios IV. For a moment, it seemed the Crusaders had solved their financial problems while reuniting Eastern and Western Christianity. But the restored emperors could not fulfill their extravagant promises. The Byzantine treasury was empty, the population hostile to Latin demands, and the political situation deteriorating rapidly. When Alexios IV was murdered in a palace coup led by Alexios V. Doukas in January 1204, the Crusaders found themselves outside a hostile city with no means of support and no clear path forward. The decision to conquer Constantinople outright was not inevitable, but it became logical within the twisted reasoning that had guided the expedition from the beginning. If the Byzantines would not pay voluntarily, the Crusaders would take what they were owed by force. The theological justification that the Greeks were schismatics who had betrayed the crusading cause provided spiritual cover for what was essentially armed robbery. The final assault on April 12th to 13th, 1204, broke through the sea wall again, but this time there would be no negotiated surrender. What followed was 3 days of systematic looting that shocked even medieval observers accustomed to urban warfare. The sack of Constantinople was not mere military pillaging, but deliberate cultural destruction, aimed at eliminating Byzantine political and religious independence. The attackers targeted not just treasure, but symbols of Byzantine identity and Orthodox faith. The Great Library of Constantinople, containing manuscripts that preserved classical texts nowhere else available, was scattered and largely destroyed. Churches were stripped of their ornaments, icons were melted down for their precious metals, and relics accumulated over centuries were divided among Western collectors. The desecration of Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Eastern Christian world, became the enduring symbol of Latin brutality. Crusaders stabled their horses in the nave, tore down the iconostasis, and installed a prostitute on the patriarchal throne to mock Orthodox ceremonies. The building that had embodied the synthesis of Christian faith and imperial power for nearly 7 centuries was reduced to a trophy of Western conquest. But perhaps most devastating was the systematic destruction of administrative records and legal codes that had preserved Roman law and Byzantine governmental practices for over 8 centuries. The Latin conquerors had no interest in maintaining the sophisticated bureaucratic systems that had enabled the empire's survival. They wanted only its wealth and territory. The establishment of the Latin Empire represented the ultimate corruption of crusading ideals. Baldwin of Flanders, crowned as the first Latin emperor, ruled not as a temporary guardian of Christian unity, but as a conqueror dividing spoils among his followers. The Byzantine Empire was carved up like a feudal estate, with Western nobles receiving duchies and counties in territories they barely understood. The partition of the empire revealed the expedition's true priorities. Venice claimed the most strategically valuable territories, key ports, islands, and trading centers that would enhance its commercial dominance. The other Crusaders received inland territories that required constant military effort to hold against hostile populations and neighboring powers. The impact on Eastern Christianity was catastrophic and enduring. The Orthodox Church, suddenly subjected to Latin authority, faced systematic pressure to abandon its theological traditions and liturgical practices. The forced conversion of Orthodox clergy and the replacement of Greek bishops with Latin appointees shattered ecclesiastical structures that had existed since the Apostolic era. The sack of Constantinople represented more than military conquest. It was cultural genocide, the deliberate destruction of a civilization that had preserved and transmitted classical learning, Christian theology, and imperial governance for over a millennium. The Fourth Crusade had succeeded in destroying the very Christian empire it had originally been summoned to protect. The Fourth Crusade also demonstrated how the crusading framework could be applied to virtually any conflict involving Christians and non-Christians, or even Christians and different Christians. The theological justifications developed for attacking Constantinople would be recycled for centuries, providing spiritual cover for political aggression across Europe and beyond. This adaptability proved crucial to crusading's longevity. The Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France, the Northern Crusades against Baltic pagans, and the ongoing Reconquista in Iberia all drew legitimacy from the crusading ideal while serving distinctly regional purposes. The papacy's willingness to extend crusading privileges to these diverse conflicts created a permanent framework for sanctified violence that extended far beyond the original Eastern focus. The development of crusading taxation, indulgences, and legal privileges created powerful institutional interests in maintaining the crusading system. The military orders, in particular, became international powers whose survival depended on continued warfare, creating incentives for conflict that often transcended genuine religious motivation. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century fundamentally altered the strategic environment in which the Crusades operated. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 ended the Abbasid Caliphate and eliminated one of Islam's most important unifying symbols. Mongol conquests in Syria and Anatolia disrupted the political structures that had defined Christian-Muslim conflict for over a century. Ironically, the Mongol threat created opportunities for Christian-Muslim cooperation that would have been unthinkable during the height of crusading fervor. The Ilkhanate's initial tolerance for Christianity and its conflicts with the Mamluk Sultanate opened possibilities for Crusader-Mongol alliances that some European leaders eagerly pursued. But the Mongol disruption also accelerated the consolidation of Mamluk power in Egypt and Syria. The Mamluk military system, based on slave soldiers trained from childhood in martial arts, proved remarkably effective against both Mongol cavalry and Crusader heavy infantry. Under leaders like Baybars and Al-Ashraf Khalil, the Mamluks systematically reduced Crusader territories through sustained campaigns that combined military pressure with diplomatic isolation. The fall of Acre on May 18, 1291, marked the end of nearly 2 centuries of sustained Christian presence in the Levant. The last Crusader strongholds fell within months, eliminating the territorial foundation of the crusading enterprise. The evacuation was chaotic and incomplete, leaving behind not just fortifications and treasure, but also communities that had developed their own distinctive identity over multiple generations. The Mamluk victory was methodical and complete. Unlike earlier Islamic reconquests, which had often allowed Christian communities to remain under Muslim rule, the Mamluks systematically destroyed Crusader fortifications and expelled Christian populations to prevent any future attempts at reconquest. This thoroughness reflected both military calculation and the recognition that the Crusader presence had represented more than temporary occupation. The end of the Crusader States forced European Christianity to confront the ultimate failure of its greatest enterprise. 2 centuries of warfare, massive expenditure of resources, and incalculable human suffering had ultimately achieved nothing permanent. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, Eastern Christianity remained separated from Rome, and the Islamic world had demonstrated remarkable capacity for recovery and adaptation. Yet focusing solely on territorial outcomes obscures the profound transformations that the Crusades had produced in both Christian and Islamic societies. The development of European state capacity, the expansion of commercial networks, the evolution of military technology, and the creation of new forms of religious and cultural identity all reflected crusading influence. The Crusades had forced European Christians to think beyond their immediate localities and to conceive of their faith as a global enterprise requiring coordinated action across vast distances. This expansion of imaginative horizons contributed to the development of European exploration, missionary activity, and eventually colonial expansion that would define the early modern period. Similarly, the Islamic response to the Crusades had accelerated political unification, religious revival, and military innovation that strengthened Muslim societies for centuries. The concept of defensive jihad, refined through anti-Crusader warfare, provided a framework for resistance to later European expansion that proved remarkably durable. Perhaps most significantly, the Crusades established patterns of Christian-Muslim interaction that persisted long after the last Crusader fortress fell. The notion that religious difference necessitated political conflict, that cultural contact inevitably led to cultural contamination, and that military victory validated religious truth, all became embedded in both Christian and Islamic political thought. The Crusades ended not with dramatic collapse, but with gradual recognition that the world had changed in ways that made their original objectives impossible. The rise of powerful centralized states, the development of gunpowder weapons, the expansion of global trade networks, and the emergence of new forms of religious and political authority had created strategic environments fundamentally different from those of the 11th and 12th centuries. Yet the memory of the Crusades proved more durable than their territorial achievements. For European Christians, they remained proof that faith could inspire extraordinary accomplishments, even if those accomplishments proved temporary. For Muslims, they represented both the dangers of division and the possibilities of unity, providing historical precedents for resistance to foreign domination. The ultimate lesson of the Crusades may be that history is made not by abstract forces, but by human beings making choices under pressure, often with incomplete information and competing loyalties. The Crusaders who captured Jerusalem in 1099 could not have anticipated that their victory would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken Islamic unity. The Muslim leaders who lost the Holy City could not have foreseen that reconquest would require nearly 2 centuries of sustained effort and fundamental political transformation. In the end, the Crusades remind us that the relationship between faith and power, between idealism and pragmatism, between cultural identity and universal values, remains as complex and challenging today as it was nearly a millennium ago. Their story offers not simple lessons, but better questions about the human condition and the unintended consequences of our most cherished convictions. Subscribe, and welcome to the Empire.